Economy headed to another Great Depression? Anyone who is hoping that the global economy would finally return to normal this year following more than 2 years of dislocation from the COVID-19 pandemic has been sorely disappointed. The world is confused and frightened. COVID-19 infections are on the rise across the US and around the world, even in countries that once thought they had contained the virus. Then, the war in Ukraine, elevated inflation, and higher interest rates are raising concerns that the world economy is on the brink of a recession. Several reliable economic indicators are flashing warning signs that the economy could be rolling over. Climate change and extreme weather has devastated different parts of the world, especially agriculture. The energy crisis due to the war in Ukraine has debilitated economies in Europe, which greatly affects the developing countries in Asia. Due to these unfortunate global events, economists warned about the continuous recession in the long run, which might result in an economic depression. This thought has been looming over the minds of economists, or just normal people alike, in the last 2 years. In this video, let's discuss, is there really a reason for us to worry, and if the world economy is really heading towards another Great Depression? And is there a way to prevent it? But what is an economic depression? There's no formal definition of a depression, but economists generally agree that it is a severe and lengthy period of economic turmoil that impacts several countries simultaneously. The US Great Depression in the 1940s, for example, lasted more than 10 years from the stock market crash in 1929 through 1941. During a depression, the unemployment rate spikes into double digits and demand for consumer goods collapses. Companies usually slow production or shut down factories to compensate, and investment activity dries up. As a result, GDP and other measures of economic activity experience deep contractions. Recovery from depression can take years or decades. So far, the world only experienced one depression, which was the US Great Depression in the 1940s. As the effects of the depression cascaded across the US economy, millions of people lost their jobs. By 1930, there were 4.3 million unemployed. By 1931, 8 million. And in 1932, the number had risen to 12 million. By early 1933, almost 13 million people were out of work, and the unemployment rate stood at an astonishing 25%. Those who managed to retain their jobs often took pay cuts of a third or more. Out of work, Americans filled long bread lines, begged for food, or sold apples on street corners. A Chicago social worker wrote, "We see want and despair walking the streets, and our friends, sensible, thrifty families reduced to poverty." More than a third of the nation's banks failed in the 3 years following 1929. Long lines of desperate and despairing people outside banks hoping to retrieve their savings were common. Many ordinary citizens lost their life savings when banks failed. Farmers were hit particularly hard by the crisis. On top of falling prices for crops, a devastating drought in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas brought on a series of dust storms known as the Dust Bowl. In the South, sharecroppers, both white and black, endured crushing poverty and almost unimaginable degradation. African Americans suffered significantly higher levels of unemployment than whites due to pervasive racism. The financial crisis was not limited to the United States. Countries in Europe and around the world experienced the Depression. Hitler's rise to power in Germany was fueled in part by the economic slowdown, and throughout the 1930s, international tensions increased as the global economy declined. What caused the Great Depression? Throughout the 1920s, the US economy expanded rapidly, and the nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, a period dubbed the Roaring Twenties. The stock market, centered at the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street in New York City, was the scene of reckless speculation where everyone from millionaire tycoons to cooks and janitors poured their savings into stocks. As a result, the stock market underwent rapid expansion, reaching its peak in August 1929. By then, production had already declined and unemployment had risen, leaving stock prices much higher than their actual value. Additionally, wages at that time were low, consumer debt was proliferating, and the agricultural sector of the American economy entered a mild recession during the summer of 1929, as consumer spending slowed and unsold goods began to pile up, which in turn slowed factory production. Nonetheless, stock prices continued to rise, and by the fall of that year had reached stratospheric levels that could not be justified by expected future earnings. Current signs of the upcoming Great Depression. Current signs of the upcoming Great Depression. What are the signs that another depression is coming? It's been nearly a century since the US experienced depression, yet the impacts of the Great Depression still linger in the minds of policymakers and consumers alike. Although a recession may be imminent, another depression on the scale of the Great Depression is likely. For example, some characteristics of a depression include a combination of the following that's currently happening in the last 2 years. Poor stock market performance. The stock market's decline, usually calculated by broad low market indices like the S&P 500, over a prolonged period can signal a declining economy and low confidence in the stock market. Due to the recent pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the world's stock market has been greatly affected. High unemployment rates. One hallmark of the Depression is skyrocketing unemployment rates. For example, unemployment reached 24.9% during the worst of the Great Depression, while wages plummeted. To put that number in perspective, consider that the national unemployment rate was 3.5% in July 2022. When people lose their jobs, they lose the ability to buy things, and demand for product tends to follow. Currently, millions of people worldwide have been cut off from jobs due to the pandemic. COVID-19 and the pandemic resulting in the lockdown caused 114 million people to lose their jobs since 2020. Rising inflation rates. When jobs are solid, rising inflation can significantly high demand. When unemployment is high and inflation rates rise, consumers may struggle to afford everyday essentials, curbing the demand for consumer goods and services. Today, inflation all over the world is very bad. Turkey and Argentina, for example, has a whopping 83%, while the rest of the world has 10% on average. Declining home sales. During a depression, consumer spending significantly decreases in all industries. As consumers stop spending their money, home sales decline as people stay where they are or rent, rather than purchase real estate. A cooling housing market also signals an overall loss of confidence in the economy. Increased default rates. When the economy is doing well, default rates on loans and credit cards are relatively low, because people work and earn stable incomes to afford their bills. As the economy worsens, people often have trouble affording their monthly payments, leading more consumers to default on their credit cards and loans. How does the 1930s Great Depression compare to the future depression? The causes of the upcoming Great Depression will not be the same as the original, and the two events will not feel the same. For example, due to certain federal regulations that weren't in place 100 years ago, banks won't be failing in the 2030s. On the other hand, we will have a new demographic issue to contend with in the 2030s. Our aging population contrasts with the plenitude of young workers a century ago. Predominantly, the next Great Depression will be similar to its predecessor in a way that it will be unforeseen and unexpected for the vast majority of people. For that reason, the emotional strain on people and the similar pain for unprepared businesses could parallel that of the 1930s. Just as many of us will never forget the influence of COVID-19 on our lives, the Great Depression of the 2030s will impact the way we think, how we spend money, who and what we trust, and what we assign importance to in our lives. So how do you prepare for an economic depression? An economic depression creates widespread economic uncertainty, so the best way to prepare is to try and give yourself as much financial stability as possible. For example, you may want to increase the size of your emergency savings and seek out less risky investments. Depressions last much longer than recessions, so you must prepare for the potential for multiple tough years. How likely is it to happen next year? So is it going to happen? While anything is possible, it's unlikely to happen again. Central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, have learned from the past. There are better safeguards in place to protect against catastrophe, and developments in monetary policy help manage the economy. The Great Recession, for instance, had a significantly smaller impact.